Good afternoon, teacher. My name is Yadira Kando. My topic EPCs 3 randomized trial of the voxelotor in the sickle cell disease. Definition: an hereditary disease is the which red blood cells have and the abnormal semicircle should be block the small blood vessel and do not last as long as normally red blood cell. Continue my video.
Sickle cell disease, also called sickle cell anemia or just sickle cell, is a genetic disease where red blood cells can take the shape of a crescent or sickle, and that change allows them to more easily be destroyed, causing anemia, among other things. Sickle cell disease is caused by defective hemoglobin, which is the oxygen-carrying protein in red blood cells. Hemoglobin is actually made up of 4 peptide chains, each bound to a heme group. Different hemoglobins have different combinations of these chains. Hemoglobin A, or HbA, is made up of 2 alpha globin and 2 beta globin peptide chains. This is the primary hemoglobin affected in sickle cell. Specifically, the beta globin chains end up misshapen. This is because of a mutation in the beta globin gene, or HBB gene. Sickle cell is an autosomal recessive disease, so a mutation in both copies of the beta globin gene is needed to get the disease. If the person has just one copy of the mutation and one normal HBB gene, then they're a sickle cell carrier, also called sickle trait. Having sickle trait does not cause health problems unless the person is exposed to extreme conditions, like high altitude or dehydration, where some sickle cell disease-like symptoms can crop up. What it does do is decrease the severity of infection by Plasmodium falciparum malaria. So in parts of the world with a high malaria burden, like Africa and pockets of southern Asia, those with sickle trait actually have an evolutionary advantage. This phenomenon is called heterozygote advantage, and its unfortunate consequence is a high rate of sickle cell disease in people from these parts of the world. Almost always, the sickle cell mutation is a non-conservative missense mutation that happens in the 6th amino acid of beta globin being a valine instead of glutamic acid. A non-conservative substitution means that the new amino acid, or valine, which is hydrophobic, has different properties than the one it replaced, glutamic acid, which is hydrophilic. A hemoglobin tetramer with 2 alpha globin and 2 mutated beta globin proteins is called sickle hemoglobin, or HbS. HbS carries oxygen perfectly well, but when deoxygenated, HbS changes its shape, which allows it to aggregate with other HbS proteins and form long polymers that distort the red blood cell into a crescent shape, a process called sickling. Conditions favorable for sickling include acidosis, which decreases hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen, and small, low-flow vessels where red blood cells' hemoglobin molecules have plenty of time to dump lots of oxygen molecules. Repeated sickling of red blood cells damages their cell membranes and promotes premature destruction. Since this happens within the vasculature, it's called intravascular hemolysis. This destruction of red blood cells not only leads to anemia, which is a deficiency in red blood cells or loss of the normal levels of hemoglobin, but also means a lot of hemoglobin spilling out. Free hemoglobin in the plasma is bound by a molecule called haptoglobin and gets recycled, which is why a low haptoglobin level is a sign of intravascular hemolysis. Recycling of that heme group yields unconjugated bilirubin, which at high concentration can cause scleral icterus, jaundice, and bilirubin gallstones.
Application is nurse. Application is nurse a control laboratory figure what for warning signals, avoiding injury and the positive traumatic risk, establishing protection measure, orange in hidden car, use of salt brew on the swab, avoiding the advanced techniques, assess dependencies of the self car, what you did it to avoid constipation. Continue my video. Continue pros and the cons. For sickle cell anemia is usually made at avoiding episodes of the pain, relieving symptoms of the preventing complications. Treatment can include medications or blood transfusions for some children and things. Stem cell transplant may correct the disease. Continue my video.
In people with sickle cell disease, their red blood cells become deformed, turning sickle-shaped. The bone marrow tries to make more red cells to make up for the loss, but can't keep up, causing anemia. Their new shape keeps them from moving properly through the body, and the misshapen cells can jam up and stick to the walls of the blood vessels. These clumps cut off oxygen to healthy tissue, delaying a child's normal growth and causing fatigue and extreme pain.
Usually applied in the Ecuador. In Ecuador, a total of the 2 74 participants were randomly assessed. Most the participants had sickle cell anemia. Homozygous hemoglobin C or the hemoglobin C and approximately two-thirds were receiving hydroxyl of the Vaseline. Anemia worsened between the Vaseline and the waking 24 is a fewer participants in the eating voxelotor dosal group. That is the dose receiving placebo. The percent of the participants which adverse event that occur or worsened during the treatment period was similar across the three groups. Most adverse events were not related to the D3 drug or the placebo as determined by the investigator. Continue my video.
Know the effects.
Some of the effects of sickle cell disease include anemia, pain, infection, jaundice, acute chest syndrome, pneumonia, organ damage, stroke, psychosocial issues, social, emotional, academic. When the sticky sickle cells become lodged in blood vessels, a number of problems can occur depending on the location of the blockage. Clogging of the spleen can prevent it from fighting off germs in the body, leading to increased risk of infections. This is why a fever is a medical emergency for a child with sickle cell disease.
Pain as it relates to sickle cell disease is one of the most common complications that we see in patients who have sickle cell anemia or sickle cell disease. When you don't have oxygen, when you have a lack of oxygen to the tissues, it causes tissue damage and sometimes tissue death, what we call tissue necrosis, which sends off signals that cause pain. And there are times where there can be chronic areas that have had repeated damage. So repeated insults of lack of oxygen to a particular tissue, which can cause more permanent damage or scarring.
Conclusion. In the disease PC3 randomized placebo-controlled 3 involuntary participants with sickle cell disease. Voxelotor significantly increased hemoglobin levels in the regions in the mark of the hemolysis. This is findings on the consider which invitations of the is polymerizations and the indicate and the disease modific potential. Continue my video is the conclusion.
Sickle cell anemia is a genetic disease that affects hemoglobin, the oxygen transport molecule in the blood. The disease gets its name from the shape of the red blood cells under certain conditions. Some red blood cells become sickle-shaped, and these elongated cells get stuck in small blood vessels so that parts of the body don't get the oxygen they need. Sickle cell anemia is caused by a single code letter change in the DNA. This in turn alters one of the amino acids in the hemoglobin protein. Valine sits in the position where glutamic acid should be. The valine makes the hemoglobin molecules stick together, forming long fibers that distort the shape of the red blood cells, and this brings on an attack.
Thank you.